The Great Depression was the deepest and longest-lasting economic downturn in the history of the Western industrialized world. The American economy entered an ordinary recession during the summer of 1929 as consumer spending dropped and unsold goods began to pile up, slowing production. At the same time, stock prices continued to rise, and by the fall of that year, they had reached levels that could not be justified by anticipated future earnings. On October 24, 1929, the stock market crumbled as investors began dumping their shares. The Great Depression was caused by many factors. As the 20s advanced, important industries began to struggle. These included the agriculture, railroad, textile, steel, mining, lumber, automobile, housing, and consumer goods industries. None was impacted as harshly as the agriculture industry. During World War I, demand for crops was high in Europe, and American farmers flourished. However, once the war ended, farmers continued producing a surplus of crops, causing the prices to plummet. Overproduction also plagued the consumer goods industry. Rising prices, low wages, and overuse of credit caused a steep drop in consumer purchases. The gap between the rich and the poor continued to widen in the 20s, with 70% of American families making less than $2,500 a year. By 1929, 4 million Americans owned stocks. Many Americans bought bonds on speculation, which is when a person buys a stock hoping to make a quick profit. Americans were also buying on margin, which is when someone pays a small percentage of a stock's price as a down payment and borrows the rest. After the stock market crash in October 1929, many Americans who bought stock on margin were left with huge debts. The economy plummeted and unemployment skyrocketed. Many Americans also withdrew all of their money from banks. These were called bank runs. However, the banks had invested the money in the stock market and lost it all after the crash. By 1933, 11,000 banks had collapsed. Europe was also suffering. In 1930, Congress passed the Hawley-Smoot Tariff. It was meant to protect the U.S. but had the opposite effect. Other countries enacted tariffs and world trade fell 40%. Herbert Hoover won the 1928 presidential election. Hoover was not quick to react to the Depression. He did not want the government to interfere with the economy or the citizens. He believed in rugged individualism, the idea that people will succeed through their own effort. Hoover eventually let up on his position on government intervention, but it was too little too late. He created the Federal Farm Board to help farmers out of debt. He also created the National Credit Organization to help smaller banks. His Federal Home Loan Bank Act and Finance Corp Act were enacted to protect homes and businesses. In the summer of 1932, 2,000 World War I vets refused to leave Washington after the Putnam Bill, a bill to pay the vets their bonus immediately, was turned down by Congress. Hoover sent 1,000 soldiers under General Douglas MacArthur and Dwight Eisenhower. The vets were gassed and forced to leave. This gave Hoover an even worse reputation and dashed any chance he had of re-election. At the height of the Great Depression, 24.9% of Americans were unemployed. Hundreds of thousands of Americans were homeless and tried to find shelter where they could. Many lived in Hoovervilles, the nickname given to homeless encampments that were living together like a small city. Many Americans blamed Hoover for the Great Depression, calling him a do-nothing president, and wanted a leader who would actively try to assist the nation. Photographer Dorothea Lange traveled the country and documented the struggles of the homeless and the poor through her photography. The Great Depression also caused a huge loss in trust of the banking system in the U.S. Many people did not use banks after the Depression was over. In 1932, Franklin Roosevelt won the presidential election because he was seen as a man of action. In his inaugural address, Roosevelt restored confidence when he said, "The only thing we have to fear is fear itself." Roosevelt's plan for the U.S. was called the New Deal. Its main goal was to save capitalism. It would accomplish this through 3 steps: relief, recovery, and reform. Relief aimed to provide jobs to the unemployed and help farmers out of foreclosure. Recovery aimed to get the economy functioning again. And reform was new laws to regulate banks, abolish child labor, and conserve farmlands. At the beginning of the Depression, the future for organized labor looked bleak. Laborers had struggled to get rights for many years, and an economic downturn made it difficult for them to gain any ground. However, when FDR became president, one of his main goals was to support organized labor with the New Deal. Unions like the AFL supported bills like the NIRA, which was declared unconstitutional. Many of FDR's efforts to help labor unions were struck down either in Congress or the Supreme Court. The National Recovery Act was legislation passed to create a partnership between business, labor, and government to defeat the Depression with measures like price controls, higher wages, and codes of fair competition. The New Deal attacked the banking problem with the Emergency Banking Act in 1933. It shut down all banks, including the Federal Reserve, for 4 days so the government could inspect the banks to ensure they were healthy. It also created the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation and abandoned the gold standard. The New Deal founded many new organizations to help unemployed citizens like the Civilian Conservation Corps, the Public Works Administration, and the Federal Emergency Relief Association. In 1933, the Agriculture Adjustment Act was passed by Congress. It reduced agricultural production by paying farmers subsidies not to plant on part of their land and to kill off excess livestock. These subsidies were paid for by levying taxes on companies who processed farm products. In 1936, the Supreme Court decided in United States v. Butler that the act was unconstitutional for levying this tax on the processors only to have it paid back to the farmers. Regulation of agriculture was also deemed a state power. However, the Agricultural Adjustment Act of 1938 remedied these technical issues and the farm program continued. The Tennessee Valley Authority was founded to help develop the Tennessee Valley region, which had been hit hard by the Depression. The National Recovery Agency was meant to be the focal point of FDR's New Deal. It created fair labor codes and guaranteed union recognition. It was declared unconstitutional in Schechter Poultry Company v. U.S. because it restricted interstate commerce and delegated legislative power to the executive branch. Conservative Democrats formed the American Liberty League and opposed the New Deal as corrupt patronage politics. Hoover and Republicans labeled the New Deal as socialist and warned against it. Charles Coughlin created the National Union for Social Justice. Members of this group claimed the New Deal benefited the wealthy and not the poor. Dr. Francis Townsend suggested a revolving pension scheme for the elderly. Senator Huey Long called for all incomes over $1 million to be seized and redistributed to the poor. After FDR's first New Deal failed to accomplish everything he had hoped for, he began the second New Deal, which emphasized reform more than recovery. The Social Security Act gave money to states to aid dependent children, established unemployment insurance through payroll deduction, and set up old age pensions for retirees. The National Labor Relations Act put restraints on employers and created the National Labor Relations Board to protect the rights of organized labor. The Fair Labor Standards Act set minimum wage at 40 cents, prohibited child labor, and set the maximum work week at 40 hours. The U.S. Housing Authority used federal funds to tear down slums and build better housing. Conservatives still believed that the New Deal was socialism and that it violated the Constitution and encouraged an idle nation and spent too much money. Radicals believed that the New Deal was not doing enough and pushed FDR to take bigger steps. Eventually, these opponents to the New Deal pushed FDR to take steps to ensure the success of the New Deal. This included his court packing plan. The court packing plan proposed increasing Supreme Court justices from 9 to 15 so that FDR could pack the court with supporters of the New Deal. However, it failed to pass. FDR irritated Congress, and most began to oppose any New Deal legislation, which effectively ended the New Deal.